Hi, my name is David Knight, and welcome to those amazing Psalms. Psalm 25, Praying Like a Bungee Jumper. Psalm 25 is a prayer that weaves together confidence with regret and lament, but the dominant thread is confidence in God. In the Psalm's opening words, David, the poet, says, "O Lord, I lift my life to you. I trust you, my God." It reminds me of a bungee jumper, not a reckless adventure seeker, but one who is all in with complete and utter trust. In verse 5, he says, "All day long, I put my hope in you." This hope is an active posture of patient waiting, hoping and anticipating, but not knowing when the answer will come, and with no plan B just in case. The psalm ends with the same phrase, essentially saying, "God, all my eggs are in your basket. Please don't disappoint me." In fact, what David dreads most is to be disappointed and disgraced in the eyes of his community. The world of the Bible was an honor-shame culture. Public shame was the ultimate horror. Losing the esteem of your peers was to lose everything. David pleads with God to guard his honor. At the beginning in verse 2 and at the end in verse 20, "Do not let me be disgraced." He is totally vulnerable, confessing his complete trust in God and expressing his worst fears. Laced throughout the prayer, David reminds himself why he trusts God, namely God's character of compassion and unfailing love, which he has shown to his people since ancient time, his faithfulness and mercy. The Lord is good and does what is right. Israel's God was not a moody, powerful deity who made arbitrary decisions and who had to be placated, but a relational God, a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. On the strength of God's high ethical character and unfailing love, David appeals to God to intervene for him in three specific areas that distress him. As he looks back, he is embarrassed by the sins of his youth, which are many, he says, and he asks God to forgive him, to wipe out the shame of the past. He asks God to practice selective memory, to remember God's never-ending compassion, but to remember not David's resume of sins. In verse 11, he even has the audacity to suggest that forgiving David's sins would advance God's honor. Indeed, the fact that God does graciously forgive our failures and sins is one of the most magnificent aspects of his glory. David's circumstances in the present are a distressing array of problems. Adversaries, pain, loneliness. He's under attack and feels terribly isolated. He asks God to turn towards him and observe his troubles and to feel his pain. "Protect me and rescue my life," he prays desperately. But the psalm ends with him still waiting for God, which is a measure of his great trust. But the dominant request in David's prayer is for guidance, for God to reveal the right path to follow. "Show me your ways, O God. Teach me your paths," he says. This is vastly different from the pagan search for supernatural signs and omens. David is not looking for magic, but for wisdom. He looks to God as a teacher and guide who desires to nurture his people in maturity and understanding. At the heart of the prayer, in verse 14, David says, "The Lord is a friend of those who fear him." God confides in them and teaches them his covenant. For David, the covenant is not a code book, but a relationship of friends. And that is why David trusts God so implicitly. Like Abraham, who was called a friend of God, David seeks to nurture this friendship with deep trust and a candid confiding that friends do with each other. This psalm shows how David nurtured this friendship with God and how we can too. David says, "My eyes are always on the Lord." This doesn't magically make his life a bed of roses, far from it, but it gives David the strength to withstand whatever challenges life throws at him. Perhaps this is why this psalm is an acrostic built on the Hebrew alphabet, symbolically saying that from A to Z there is nothing in our lives that is beyond God's care or God's capacity to deal with. From A to Z, David has learned to entrust his problems to God. He lifts his life up to God and keeps his eyes fixed on God as he waits for God to act. Let me suggest trying to write an alphabet prayer. I did that this week and found lots of loose ends lying around my heart. It was good to put them into words and get them out on paper and to share them with God. Let me know if something like that happens to you too. Take care.